Please be seated. So do you know about all those archetypal dreams about being unprepared for something? You know the ones you show up at school and there's a test you didn't know about or study for, or maybe you've somehow forgotten to wear clothing to school that day. Or if you're a priest, there's actually one in which you can't find your place in the prayer book and everybody's waiting on you and watching you. My subconscious actually added a chancel that was nothing but giant organ pedals to that dream one time. Not only could I not find my place, I had to honk my way all the way over to the lectern to start the sermon. Anyway, I know you have your own version of this dream, right? But a week ago, last Thursday, I actually thought I'd entered somebody else's nightmare of being unprepared. We were standing in the chancel of the Church of the Holy Communion, which was not filled with organ pedals at least. Daily chapel for St. Mary's School was about to begin. Girls were filing in. They were filling up the pews. Catherine Bush, the chaplain, was explaining the flow of the service to the guest speaker. After I introduce you, she said, we'll show the video clip, and then you'll have about 10 minutes to speak. Just know that when the bells ring, you'll need to begin wrapping things up. Any questions? Now, the chapel speaker's name was Spencer Reese. And if you happened to hear Spencer preach here at Calvary last week, it probably won't surprise you that he said, no, I don't think I have any questions. I don't really know what I'm going to say, though. And if you know Catherine, it won't surprise you that she replied with a kind of forced pleasantness, okay, that concerns me. But at 3 minutes to chapel time, there was nothing for us to do but worry. So we did that. We worried. It's what you do in a nightmare, even if it's somebody else's, right? But then it got just a little bit worse. After Catherine's lovely introduction and the clip from the BBC about the orphanage where Spencer taught, he did the unthinkable. He told 500 schoolgirls that when he went to Honduras, he didn't know anything about the country or about teaching or about girls. And then he said, I was nervous, kind of like I am right now. Yeah, he told them he was afraid. Didn't he know that prep school girls can smell fear? Even the 10-year-olds. He was doomed. Once they got a taste of blood, there'd be nothing to do but call his bishop and say at least he didn't suffer. But it turns out our fears were unfounded. Spencer told the girls he was a little nervous. But then he asked a fourth grader, off in the front row, whether she knew what the word authentic meant. She shook her head. He told her it was going to be her vocabulary word for the week. And then we were off. All of us. We were off into a story that began in fear and confusion and feeling completely out of place in the world, but that ended in authenticity and acceptance and hope. After chapel, a line of girls formed quickly to say their thanks to the speaker, at least one of whom who was in tears, because a version of her own story, a story she thought no one in her world could possibly understand, had just been told by the person in the room least like her of all, the priest up in the chancel, nervous, lanky, and gay, a little awkward but disarmingly authentic. Consensus is that grace happened that morning at St. Mary's, and if you don't believe me, you can even ask Catherine. Apparently, you see, there are different ways to be prepared. Now, I've struggled with this parable of the wise and foolish virgins for a long time. I think I've struggled with it because the fear of being unprepared is an easy fear to play on, isn't it? Remember that bumper sticker that used to say, Jesus is coming soon, look busy. It's funny, I like it, but for a long, long time, I actually thought that the fear of being unprepared was one of the chief ways God kept us on our toes. Keep awake. Jesus will come like a thief in the night. You better be ready or else. But there's just too much else in Jesus' teaching and in the rest of Scripture about things like perfect love casting out fear, about trusting in God's generous provisions and not worrying about tomorrow, about being saved by grace, not works, lest we boast. There's just too much contrary to this idea that we have got to be frightened enough of being found unworthy or unready in order to get our Christian act together. So what is this parable about? What is this parable supposed to do? Well, to begin with, it's worth noting that what's at stake in the story is not punishment or embarrassment or pain, is it? What's at stake is missing out on a wedding banquet, missing out on a tremendous feast. And it's also worth noting that the reason to have enough oil in your lamp is not to have the bridegroom praise you for being ready. A lighted lamp is for seeing, a means of illuminating something or someone wonderful when he arrives into your life. So look at the parable again. This is not a story about staying awake either, not just that, because the bridegroom is so late to his very own party that all the attendants get drowsy and nod off, all of them. There's no judgment about the sleeping. The moment of truth happens with that shout that comes at midnight. Everybody's jolted up from their dreams, and they scramble to light their lamps. Why? So they can see the bridegroom arrive and begin the party they've all been waiting for in this giddy anticipation. I guess it's really a parable about keeping hope alive, isn't it? It's about keeping hope alive even when the thing you've been hoping for keeps not happening. I've been thinking about hope. I think it's so much more at the heart of this parable than a supposedly corrective fear about being caught unprepared. But hope is one of those Christian virtues, like faith, that at least in my life can begin to seem like something we're just obliged to keep high enough levels up in our souls for God to be pleased with us. It can sound like Christians think hope is important because God likes people better when they're hopeful, or God loves people more when they've got faith. So you'd better have some faith and some hope when Jesus comes back. He won't be pleased with you if you don't. Ever feel that way? But faith and hope are not ends in themselves. In a sense, they work like a kind of gratitude for the future, don't they? Think about it. Gratitude's about being at peace with our past, isn't it? Whatever our stories, our past will have contained some mixture of gifts and pain, joys and wounds. But none of us hopes to be a little bit more resentful of the past each day of our lives, do we? No. Gratitude is its own reward. It's almost a perfect synonym for joy, for happiness, for well-being. And doesn't hope function in much the same way with regard to the future? It's how the possibility of goodness in the future might hold, whatever it might hold, might leak into our lives right now. It works just like gratitude, because the present is always slipping away from us. We're always either looking backward in memory or forward in expectation. And if the past makes us resentful and the future makes us afraid, this present moment is not going to be much of a wedding banquet at all, is it? Not one I'd care to attend, at least. So how do we do it? How do we trim our wicks? How do we fill our lamps? How do we let the goodness of the past fall into our lives as thankfulness, not resentment, and the goodness of the future fall into them as hope and not fear? Well, perhaps there are different ways of being prepared. It seems we each of us have some soul tending to do in this process. We have to take up practices in our lives that'll cultivate this hope for the future, not fear, even as that future remains so uncertain to us, and a mystery that we'll never be able to control entirely. For Christians, I think this soul work begins in Eucharist. Eucharist literally means thanksgiving, right? Week after week, the practice of receiving the Eucharistic gifts, the thankfulness gifts, is meant to form us as a grateful people over time. The wounds and resentments of the past really can lose their claim on the present in the rhythms of this Eucharistic life. Gratitude can fill the void if we let it. And Eucharist always looks forward. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again, we say. We're here to give thanks for a future that's not yet arrived. We want its goodness to leak into our present lives, whatever they may be, not as fear, but as this wonderful, expectant hope. But I think our souls need more than a weekly tending. We need to be honest about how the practices and priorities of our lives shape us. There are whole industries, after all, out there designed to play on our resentments of the past and our fears of the future. So what soul work are we doing every day to keep gratitude and hopefulness alive in our souls? What forms of prayer and contemplation, what patterns of quiet and acts of generosity, what rhythms of work and play, to what essential relationships must you attend to keep awake, open, vulnerable? And let's be real. What media and what messages must we simply stop giving so much access to our souls? What practices do you and I need to establish to keep our lamps full and our wicks trimmed? Not so that God will be pleased with us. You're already loved beyond measure. What practices help us see Jesus when he comes to us? That'll help us keep hope alive on days when he seems a long, long time in coming as well. My friend Spencer prepared to be awake in the present moment by refusing to be terribly prepared. Myself, I'm going to keep typing these sermons out. Hopefully there really are different ways for different people to be prepared. But those of us who tend toward preparation by means of absolute control will almost certainly need to find practices in our lives that cultivate vulnerability and letting go. And make no mistake, the urgency of Jesus' parables is as real as their grace. We do only have so much time in this life. All we ever really have is this moment to begin filling our lamps, trimming our wicks, practicing a kind of gratitude for a future we'll never be able to control. The fear of being unprepared is not what's meant to drive our Christian lives. That's the work of gratitude and of hope. And if Jesus is to be trusted, it's not a measured, careful hope that he wants for us, but apparently something like you might find in 5 young virgins, tittering, expectant, giddy with anticipation for a banquet they wouldn't miss for all the world. They're the ones Jesus holds up for you and for me to emulate. They're the ones Jesus calls prepared, hopeful, awake. They're the ones in this story Jesus actually calls wise. Amen.